Okay, we're going to try something a little bit different with this. I have invited Lisa to join us. For those of you that are involved with the signing up with classes and things like that, Lisa is the person that you talk to. She's my wife and partner in this business, but more importantly to you guys is the fact that she recently came through these classes. So one of the problems with filming like this is that it doesn't give a lot of opportunity for give and take. So since we're talking about agency, I thought we would try this to see if there are any questions that resonated with her that may in fact resonate with you guys as well. So anyway, we'll start off with some relatively simple stuff. As it gets more complicated, let me know if there's some things that you thought when you were coming through the class that were important at the time. So we're talking about agency relationships. So let's start off talking about exclusive seller agency. At the beginning of these slides for chapter 7, I did a drawing on the board and I said, prior to the 1990s, everybody in real estate and residential real estate anyway practiced this way. Everybody worked for the seller. If you say, why did everybody work for the seller? Well, the reason is because the seller paid the commission and the seller had nothing to sell. So it just made sense. Problem is that you started having buyers that were recognizing that, hey, I'm giving these agents all this information and the agents are taking that information back to the seller. So the seller knows exactly how much I'll pay or how motivated I am or something to that effect. And this all came to a head in the mid 90s. I'm sorry, yeah, it was mid 90s, when there was a lawsuit in Minnesota. Edina Real Estate ended up being sued by buyers who were involved in these, what were ultimately undisclosed dual agency situations, where they were not being told that the agent was representing both the buyer and the seller. So anyway, exclusive seller agency, there's nothing wrong with it. It's perfectly legal today. You don't see it a whole lot today because there are other options. But an exclusive seller agency, it means that all agents of that firm will represent the seller. Here's the problem with that. The problem with that is once you've sold the house, you can't have an ongoing relationship with that client until they need to sell again. Because what's going to happen is when they need a buyer's agent, exclusive seller agency did not allow firms to be able to do that. So that was a problem with that. And then, of course, as we evolved into the 90s and got into buyer agency, some buyers, some firms realized that there was a benefit from that. So let's go ahead and segue into that. Certainly today, buyer agency is alive and well, and you see it in most cases. There are literally some firms that practice only buyer agency. So let's go through that again real quickly. In a buyer agency only firm, good news, bad news, one of the good things that a firm says is we only represent buyers, therefore we're never going to have a conflict of interest. That's their big selling point, is that there is no conflict of interest. Whether you find that compelling or not will be another question, but this is a perfectly legitimate way to do business as well. And if your firm only does buyer agency, you're not going to be able to work with any sellers. So that's a little bit of a draw. But now notice we've also started introducing something else as well. And here's where it starts getting a little bit tricky when it comes to agency. Lisa, I told them a little bit earlier that all agency agreements had to be in writing, but now I'm coming back and saying that a buyer agency can be oral to start with. A buyer agency can be oral to start with, but it must be reduced to writing no later than the offer to purchase. So that's the first time we see that, and that will be an important rule as we go forward. Okay? Questions or comments so far? You good?
I was trying to remember, is it just that it can only, that it has to be unspecified and it can't be exclusive, right? Is that?
Yeah, the problem with oral buyer agency is, in fact, those two things. One, if we're in an oral buyer agency agreement, it doesn't have a date on it because it's oral, so we haven't really agreed to it. And the toughest part for agents to realize is it's not exclusive. I can't tell you how many times as a broker in charge, someone has come into my office and said, I was working with a buyer, and then I found out that they worked with another agent, ended up buying a house with another agent. And I'd say, well, do you have a written buyer agency agreement? They would say, no. So I knew what happened. They were working under an oral buyer agency agreement. The agent was probably thinking they were pretty secure, but it clearly was not exclusive. And one weekend when the agent was doing something else, they just went out and got another agent. And that agent did, in fact, put it in writing and sold them the house. So that's a great question. Couple of rules here. Buyer agency can be oral, but it must be reduced to writing at the time that an agent demands exclusivity or before the first offer to purchase. Okay. Otherwise, buyer agency is fine. Most firms today are going to have the option And when we get to single agency, I know that sounds very, very, one, but the fact of the matter is what it's referring to is a firm that has chosen that they will work with buyers and they will work with sellers, but not in the same transaction. In other words, they have just flat out made a policy that they're not going to work with both buyer and seller in the same
So
transaction.
that means like if I'm working with a buyer and somebody else in my firm has a listing, my buyer could not buy that listing. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that is one of the problems with it. I mean, it does avoid a conflict of interest, but it could put you in a tough situation. Did you say you had the buyer?
I have the buyer
Okay.
and somebody else has
I have
the
the
listing in
listing.
my agency.
Okay. If you have a buyer and I have the listing and we're the same firm, then one of us is going to have to refer our client out if we have a policy that says specifically that we will only work with buyers or sellers at the M1 transaction. Perfectly legit. However, this is where we're going to get to what we see in most cases today. Don't worry about sub-agency. Go ahead and jump into dual agency. Now, in dual agency, we're getting ready to hit a really, really difficult part here. We'll delve into it now, and then in the next chapter, we'll look at the agency agreements that go along with this. And I think they're very explanatory. But for right now, let's just say this. Dual agency is when one firm is working with both the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. That is dual agency. Now, let me tell you that there is actually a law against this. This is not just some petty rule. This is a law. State law 93A6-4 says that you cannot work for more than one party in a transaction without the agreement of all parties. So when it comes to dual agency like this, what I have just said is that as my firm, I can do it. I just need to make sure that I have the agreement of both parties. And by the way, very, very tough test question. When does dual agency have to be reduced to writing? We'll go into that in a little more detail a little bit later, but I'll say this right now. A lot of people say oral dual agency cannot exist, but the way I refer to it is in the days that oral buyer agency exists, oral dual agency can arise. So that's just kind of your nugget for right now, and we will revisit that a little bit later. Now, notice what I said about state law. State law said I must have the informed consent of both parties, right? Okay, here's the problem with that. Undisclosed dual agency is against the law. It is just flat out against the law. Undisclosed dual agency. And you may say, well, I'm not likely to get in that situation. I would assiduously avoid it. But having said that, do you know what the most simple case of undisclosed dual agency where it arises in most cases? Think about it. In an open house, if you're the agent and you're doing the open house, obviously you work for the seller. Now, having said that, when a buyer walks in, obviously as an agent, you're going to turn on your charms. You're going to try to impress them. You're trying to get to know them or whatever. The next thing you know, you've created an agency agreement, or at least in their mind, you're starting to act like their agent. You're asking them, do they want the house? Do they have the money? And things like that. So now the buyer thinks you work for them. You actually work for the seller. What you've done is you've created an undisclosed dual agency here. Again, there's nothing wrong with dual agency, but in this case, there's two things going on that are not true. That buyer thinks you work for him and you've not had an agency discussion with them. They might start giving you confidential information before you're ready for it, and that's why it's a problem, okay? You can see on the bottom of this page, disclosed dual agency is fine. Both parties in writing at the appropriate time. And basically what the dual agency agreement says is, hey, buyer, do you understand I'm also working for the seller? Hey, seller, do you also understand I'm working for the buyer? And in this capacity, I act almost more as a referee than I do as a coach. I've also heard people say it that way. Okay, questions so far? You in good shape?
I think so.
Okay. Now, as we get into dual agency, recognize that one of the problems with dual agency is that if I work with a large firm, which I do, I work with a large firm, we oftentimes have buyers who are interested in our listings. And we have some people that listen to the discussion of dual agency where I said, hey, buyer, not only do I work for you, but I also work for the seller. So everything I've told you, I've told him as well, that I have to keep confidential information confidential. Sometimes a buyer will say something to the effect of, well, I don't understand how that benefits me. If you're working just as much with a seller, I don't understand how that benefits me. So that's when we get into designated dual agency. Now, again, we're here to pass a test. So when we get in the field, I'll describe this to you in better detail. But in designated dual agency, I want you to first start this conversation off with the fact that designated dual agency is a type of dual agency, meaning that you have to be in dual agency before you can even get to designated dual agency. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So in other words, it has to be ABC and ABC when you're reading the test question, buyer and seller. Okay. Now, in class, I often spend 15 or 20 minutes going over dual agency and all its permutations. And then I get to this point and I say, you actually have an alternative to dual agency, even though it's a type of dual agency. And I said, wouldn't it be great if the circumstances for dual agency existed, but I was able to tell the buyer that I'm going to more fully represent you, literally exclusively, and another agent will exclusively represent the seller. And that's exactly what designated agency is. Designated dual agency means that within a firm, one party can be designated for the buyer, another party, notice I said another party, so there minimally has to be two agents, will be designated for the seller. And in these designated capacities, the buyer, the agent working with the buyer, the agent designated literally for the buyer will work exclusively for the buyer, and the agent designated for the seller will work exclusively for the seller. So now it feels more like buyer agency and seller agency. And so a lot of students, they'll ask me, say, well, if you had something better, why didn't you just tell me about that? Why did you spend so much time talking about dual agency if you had something better anyway? Well, here's the deal. Not all firms can practice designated agency. Some firms think it's actually a liability issue. I don't. I just think it takes some explanation. In regards to designated agency, there are two rules. And you'll notice that on this slide, I actually have an asterisk beside these. And this is probably what you need to remember about designated agency. Because we need to have equal representation with the buyer and the seller, there's two strict rules that the Real Estate Commission says. Number 3 says this: a provisional broker. Now, by the way, I actually changed the wording that was on this slide because I wanted you to read it very, very specifically here. A provisional broker cannot be designated for one party if his or her broker in charge is designated for the other party. Okay, so think about this. A provisional broker has a buyer in the car and ends up showing one of his broker charges listings. You with me so far?
Yep.
Okay. Could I be designated, if I'm a PB, could I be designated for the buyer if you, the broker in charge, are designated for the seller?
No, because I think you would have too much information. Is the broker in charge, or too much power, I guess? Knowledge.
Yeah, that applies, but you know what else is more important? Actually, as the broker in charge, you have the ability to see the PB's files, and the PB might have the ability to see your files. Right. So it would not be fair. So the Real Estate Commission just simply says that cannot happen. A PB cannot be designated for the buyer if the broker in charge is designated for the seller, and vice versa, by the way. Now, what's interesting about this is the fact that it's my broker in charge. So in other words, it has little to do with experience. As provisional broker, I can be designated for for my buyer if a broker in charge of another one of our offices was designated for the seller. So in other words, my office has 2 locations. All right, we have a Holly Springs, we have a Cary, an Apex, location. So in regards to that, the broker in charge of the Holly Springs office is my broker in charge. The broker in charge of the Apex office is not my broker in charge. So a PB in Holly Springs could in fact do designated agency with a broker in charge in the Apex office. So actually, I just said 2 important things there. Okay. One, did you notice that I talked about the firm as being multiple offices? Mm-hmm. It's still dual agency. If it's one firm and it has 8 offices, it's still just one firm. Right. So dual agency would apply. Okay. But in this case, it's not my supervising broker in charge. So therefore, I could be designated with them. So rule number 1 has to do with the provisional broker and the bid. Rule number 2 says this: an agent cannot be designated for one party if they have, listen closely, prior confidential information about the other party. So let me just say this a different way. People confuse this all the time. If I am designated for the buyer, exclusive for the buyer, but yet I know that the seller has to sell their home. Maybe they're a neighbor, maybe they're a friend, whatever it is. I know they have to sell their home. They have to sell it quickly. I know they're willing to take less money. all of that would be great information, but they're listed with my firm. It should not be my goal to try to hurt another client with my firm. So in this case, I am eat up with prior confidential information. So I cannot be designated for the buyer in that particular case because I knew too much confidential information about the seller. And by the way, vice versa. I couldn't be designated for the seller if I knew too much prior information about the buyer. Now, Lisa, here's a great test question right here.
Okay, don't put me on the spot.
It's okay. Looking at number 3 and 4, all right?
Okay.
So in the first case, as the PB and the broker in charge, we cannot practice designated agency together,
Mm-hmm.
but would it be okay for us to just practice traditional dual agency?
It doesn't say you can't, so I would say yes.
Yeah, see, and that's one of the mistakes that people make on the exam. They think just because designated agency is not allowed, that dual agency would not be allowed. But remember, in dual agency,
You're not releasing confidential.
That's
That's
right.
what the referee or
yeah, we're just kind of a middleman, even though technically in North Carolina there's not a
Yeah.
middleman. That's kind of what we're doing. See, in dual agency, you don't share anybody's confidential information. So we would go back to kind of being that mediator, or how did I describe it earlier, referee, I think
Referee.
it was on that. We're still agents, we can still help these clients, but we would not share any confidential information. So keep in mind, for test purposes, just because the provisional broker and the broker in charge could not practice designated agency together, they could absolutely practice dual agency together, and that would be okay. Everybody would be neutral in that particular case.